Who said that?
The lady at the store.
That is not a compliment.
It's an ugly, nasty word, and you are going to hear it. Nothing I can do about that. But you are not going to let that word hurt you.
You got your ID? Yeah. Guess I stopped it.
Good. Now, when you get pulled over...
I'm a good driver. Okay?
Baby,
don't worry.
This is not about you getting a ticket. This is about you not coming home.
I'm gonna be okay. Right? Okay.
You are not pretty for a black girl. You are beautiful, period. Okay? Don't ever forget that.
I have a black son.
I have a black son.
I have black sons.
I have a black son.
I have 2 black sons.
I have a black son.
I have black sons.
I have a black grandson.
and we can't breathe.
Greetings, and welcome to USNow. I'm Alfonso Porter, editor of the Denver Urban Spectrum. This month, the Urban Stance panel will look at the aftermath. 3 aspects of life and death of George Floyd. Rosemary Lytle, Representative Leslie Harrod, and Reverend Quincy Shannon will share their views on systemic racism. Also, we have District Attorney Beth McCann, Juston Cooper, and journalist Susan Greene, who will talk about public policy. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Tracie Keesee, Alex Landau, and Murphy Robinson, who will address police brutality. And now for our first question. After the murder of George Floyd, it seems like the whole world was marching in solidarity with our struggle. Why has this finally happened? And do you feel this will improve international relationships and reduce systemic racism?
Think about George Floyd's killing, the very public lynching of George Floyd. It triggered something in the planetary algorithm. What it has underscored in my mind, among many other things, is that even as American influence has declined and the mythology associated with American exceptionalism has faded, what happens in the United States, whether by way of disappointment or by way of inspiration, continues to shape the course of events around the world. So whether it's tragic events like the killings of activists and journalists all over the world, whether it's what's happening with children in cages and families being separated, whether it's police abuses so frequent and unrelenting that we can't say all the names because we don't even know all the names despite the technology. We do know this one. We know George Floyd, and we know that a broad global movement has been inspired. I knew this with certainty when I saw a news broadcast from a Black Lives Matter protest in the city of Amsterdam. When I saw that protest, it was outside the hotel in which I stayed 2 years ago. So that hotel, that community, united to make a statement about police abuse halfway around the world. So the attention has focused not just on the United States, but also on entire systems of power, racism, and oppression. All of those have come under scrutiny, and it's like a global teach-in. We heard someone say recently that it's a privilege to learn about racism instead of experiencing it your whole entire life.
So after the murder of George Floyd, we saw people marching across not only Colorado and the country, but the world, demanding racial equality, talking about systemic racism, and really saying and saying loudly and proudly that Black Lives Matter. You know, we had seen some protests like this before, but definitely not in the magnitude that we've seen today. And so what I think is really interesting is with the alignment of COVID and the pandemic, and a lot of folks not working, a lot of folks really thinking about their own trauma and maybe reliving some of that, and then seeing the deaths of our sisters and brothers online on our social media feed, seeing our Blackness used as tools against us, and you know, folks calling the police and saying that I'm going to tell the police that a Black man is out here or a Black woman is threatening me. That is traumatizing, but also it cannot be normalized. It should not be normalizing, and it was beginning to. And so as we saw people out there protesting and saying enough is enough, we started to hear not only about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but so many others. In fact, people right here in Colorado, like Elijah McClain, who have died at the hands of law enforcement unjustly. And we hear the cries for them rise up. What I've also seen are people who are thinking about their own role in racism. I was just with a woman this morning who was leading the charge on anti-racism training, and she really got it. And it wasn't something that she had gotten before. She actually is married to a man of color. And, you know, it was something that just she thought she understood and didn't. And so as she's working through some of these courses herself and becoming a trainer, she's learning so much more about how she can show up in the world. So to answer the question, I absolutely think that this is an opportunity. This is a movement. This is one, a moment within the movement where we really can move policy forward, where we can really address the root causes of systemic racism and oppression. I think now is the time to do it. So this just past month, I passed a bill called the Law Enforcement Accountability and Integrity Act. That would not have passed. Sweeping reform would not have passed if it weren't for the protesters out there talking about Black Lives Matter, if it weren't for the people across Colorado who reached out to their state representatives, even in far off places like Eagle and Grand Junction, saying this matters. We got that passed because of the moment that we're in and the movement that we're in. And so, yes, I absolutely believe that we can address some of the systemic issues right now. And quite frankly, we have to.
I think we're sitting in a time where there's a perfect storm of what COVID-19 and the landscape that gave us. But I think it's a very real reality that we had people at home who were unable to do other things at a time when multiple stories were coming out around police brutality and Black bodies being harmed. This is not the first incident of a Black man being beat by the police. I'm thankful that it has woken people up. But I want to be clear that George Floyd is not the only incident that has happened. And when we think about that, we often think about like Rosa Parks and what she did for the civil rights movement. And as much as I'm thankful for Rosa Parks and what she did, she wasn't the first Black woman not to get up, or the first Black woman to be arrested, or the first Black woman on a bus in Montgomery to have issues. So as we think about like how we got to where we are, I think it's very important for us to recognize and realize, as much as I'm thankful that people are jumping on the train of what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota. So why is that important? Well, that's important in the fact that now that we see people starting to wake up, now that we see people to come together in solidarity, we start to see a very different landscape than different protests and actions that I've been a part of. I remember when Trayvon Martin was first killed and how that hurt and how that felt and how I wanted to get involved. But that hurt and that feeling didn't come because Trayvon Martin was the first young Black man. I remember Paul Childs. I went to school with Paul Childs. So I knew people who were my age who had been killed by the police. And then when we got on a national stage of others who have had that happen, it was like, no, we have to do something. I remember going to Ferguson and fighting because of Mike Brown and what Mike had done in that community. But it wasn't because Mike Brown was the first young man. It was because he lived around the corner from where my grandmother stayed. And there was a whole history of the municipalities which in Missouri that would like harass Black people when you crossed over their borders and their lines. So I think as we're thinking about the solidarity, what I'm excited about is that people are waking up. What I want to be very clear about is these are not new issues. This is a not new situation. This isn't like a one and done where George Floyd is the perfect martyr. No, there's issues within his situation, just like there's issues within all of our lives. And what I want to make sure is that's clear is that this is important for whoever shows up, however they show up. Like I've been leading different marches, protests, downtown, actions of different forms. And I've oftentimes gotten the question, well, what about the people who are just showing up because of COVID-19, about the people who are just showing up, but they really may not care about Black Lives Matter. And my answer to them is the answer that I'll say now is that those bodies are important because they helped us to get the news coverage that we needed so that little white kids are having conversations at their dinner tables that they may not have been having last night or yesterday. That we have businesses and corporations starting to step to the table in ways that they would not have or have not in the past. I think it's important to recognize and see what melanated people have dealt with throughout the world simply because of the color of our skin. Whether it is because of colorism and you start to look at people of the same ethnicity who are treated differently because they're darker. Whether you go to Asia and you see that, whether you go to Europe and you see that, whether you go to South America and you see that, whether you go to Antarctica and you see that there has been a colorism within our world where darker skinned people, darker melanated people have often been discriminated against in a disproportionate manner. But I also have gone to places like Canada and seen Black Lives Matter protests happen and them saying enough is enough, we're going to fight with you, we're going to bond with you. So what I'm hopeful for on an international stage is not only will we be able to start talking about the issues and what the very real reality of what it feels like to be a Black man in these yet to be United States, of what it feels like to walk and to move in a country that oftentimes has not even valued my existence, and more so has often come down on me simply because of the color of my skin. And I've had rights and opportunities in other places that I've never been given in the so-called land of the free. So what I'm hopeful for is that on an international stage, that as people are starting to view what is happening here, and as people are starting to wake up, that those same issues that they've dealt with in their own countries and other areas start to be issues that we can pinpoint and start to look at. Why is it that Africa was divided, sliced, and given to different countries in Europe the way that it was? Why is it that when they started to unite their currency, that the different individuals who were uniting that currency started to be branded as terrorists and started to be killed? When we really start to unpeel the onion of what is happening here in the United States, it really starts to allow us to see what has happened and what is continuing to happen around the world. And I'm hopeful that as we start to wake up a sleeping generation here, that it starts to ignite those fires all around the world in those countries, so that we can start looking and say, okay, I know what it's like to be in the Dominican Republic and have what they do to the Haitians on the very same island. What are ways that after we start dealing with issues that we have here on an international stage, that we can start working and helping those other brothers that we have around the world?
Since the beating of Rodney King in 1991 to current times, public safety has taken a drastic turn with African American communities across the country. What are the most effective ways and steps to improve public safety for African American communities?
I think that it's an interesting question because, you know, we've seen, unfortunately, a rise in violence in our city, and it impacts a lot of people, but we have had a number of homicides of young Black men, and I speak with the families who've lost a son in a violent way. And I really think that as a community, we need to be directing more resources toward education and job opportunities. So much crime is related to poverty, and I think we need to really look at how can we as a community be more supportive of all the people in our community, and we can work together to identify areas where there's need and come together to address those needs. I think that we also, you know, police officers tend to become jaded, I think, as they deal with so much criminal behavior on all levels. And I think reestablishing the relationships with the police department, you know, that we used to have with officers walking the beat. We obviously don't have enough resources for that, but I think the more that we can have the community come together and get to know each other, the better things will be. I think having discussions is among people of different races and people of different professions always improves relationships going forward. So I think there are effective ways to address some of the issues involving police and the community. And I believe that our current police chief, Chief Payson, is very committed to that. And I also am committed to it and hope that we can improve our relationships going forward.
There's a historical reference, right? We've seen police brutality throughout. If you are an African American in the country of the United States, police brutality is not a new narrative for us. We understand the history and the inception from the paddy wagon police chasing down enslaved people to where we are now. From 1991 of the beating of Rodney King to where we are now. Police brutality has been the biggest boogeyman for African Americans in this country. We know that police have been weaponized. The criminal legal system has been weaponized to control, oppress, and ultimately try to genocide the African American, especially African American men in this country. I think some of the most effective ways and steps to improve public safety for African Americans in this community is one, we need to shape the narrative of what public safety means to us as a community. Starting by inserting one word that changes the narrative and the general perception of public safety, and that is adding the word health. Public health and safety. By supplanting that one word in that narrative, it shifts how we think about what it means to the African American community. We need to drive that narrative. We need to define what it means for us in order to accomplish actually having public health and safety. See, intuitively, intellectually, and spiritually, we know what actually makes our community safe. We talk about it historically all the time in other oppressed systems: education, health, basic needs, housing, jobs, entrepreneurship, all the real public health and safety strategies that actually create a safer community and improve the quality of life for people, specifically African Americans. But often when we think about public safety, we have it synonymous with what my organization calls the 3 C's: cops, courts, and cages. We're at a critical point where cops, courts, and cages as the dominant response to our public safety is no longer effective. It hasn't been historically effective for African American communities, but at some point in time, we agreed to it. At some point in time, we were complicit to it, only for it to backfire and continue its intention and its purpose as being weaponized against us as a people. So now, in order for us to improve our public health and safety for our African American communities, we have to define the narrative, the first thing. The second thing is we have to govern it. We have got to build the infrastructure and resources in our community in order to govern our public health and safety. I'm not talking about just becoming elected officials. That's one tactic. I'm talking about embedding us in all aspects of our public health and safety, in institutions in our leadership, in public office in our leadership, in our community as activists and advocates, literally in our schools as teachers, in our hospitals as nurses, in our public health system and behavioral health systems as psychiatrists, doctors. We have to build a web of governance in order to truly promote our version of public health and safety in African American communities. And third but not least is our accountability. Now that word is thrown out all the time. But I think people fail to realize to break down the etymology of the word. Accountability means the ability to account for our actions. So in order for African American communities to truly have its own public health and safety, we have to build in the ability to account for our governance, the ability to account for our public health and safety narrative, the ability to account for the resources and infrastructure that we need to build in order to truly promote public health and safety in African American communities.
You know, there are many things to talk about. One, I would say, is photograph them. You know, not just with these body cams, but with the body cams, make sure those body cams are on. I was personally arrested because I was photographing a police questionable handling of an African-American man on Colfax, and I started photographing the police, and they handcuffed me and also told me to act like a lady. They have no sense of people's First Amendment rights, and I don't mean just the media, but everybody's First Amendment rights to take photographs of them doing their job. They just didn't seem to get it. And as we speak, there's a legal settlement in that case, and the city has still not, under the settlement, they were required to do First Amendment training so that anybody, not just media, you know, can photograph the police, and the police know what the First Amendment is, and they're not going to go handcuffing people who are holding them accountable. The city has still not made good on that commitment to hold that training. I would say vote out elected leaders who give lip service to issues like racial profiling and police brutality, but don't do anything about it. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard from this administration in Denver, Mayor Hancock's administration, that he's going to do something about excessive force when, you know, essentially almost all of the police officers who have committed excessive force have not even been reprimanded. I mean, I have to say the two officers who were messing with me for photographing them on a sidewalk got more punishment than the officers who killed Michael Marshall and Marvin Booker in the city jail. Something's messed up with that. I mean, in Aurora, it's the same thing. You've got 3 officers fired for bad behavior mocking Elijah McClain's death, but no officers fired or suspended for killing Elijah McClain. Something's messed up with that. So I would also say end a system in which a safety department investigates excessive force cases within the safety department. That cannot be done accurately, it cannot be done independently, it cannot be done objectively. So when fair and thorough investigations and truly independent investigations are conducted, and officers lose their jobs for hurting people and for killing people, they actually lose their jobs, then this kind of, I can get away with it with impunity attitude will stop. And I mean, that's almost the most basic common sense, you know, solution here that, you know, we hear Murphy talk about accountability and action. Well, where is that accountability and action? 10 years ago this week, Marvin Booker was killed in the jail. And he was killed partly with a taser that all witnesses who were there said was used for like 45, 50 seconds, right? All the officers involved said we used it for 8 seconds because that's what you're supposed to use it for, 8 seconds, right? Well, that taser suddenly was missing right after the incident, right? That taser was swapped out for another taser that during the civil trial was produced like, here, it was deployed for 8 seconds. Well, it was absolutely clear from the serial numbers that was the wrong taser. And the city 10 years later have never accounted for what is a homicide weapon. And so when I hear Murphy talking about accountability and action, I kind of want to know, are they ever going to investigate what happened to that taser that killed a man? I'm kind of sick of hearing all these buzzwords about community policing. I want to know, what are you going to do about the officers who are still on duty who have killed people? And if you are an administration that's not willing to hold them accountable, end of discussion.
brutality is not new. With the many videos revealing how massive this problem is, including most recently the death of Elijah McClain, will law enforcement agencies finally address the excessive use of force, especially against people of color, or will communities and other governing bodies have to force this change?
Police brutality is not new. You're absolutely correct, it's not new. The conversations we're having are not new. What is new is that folks are actually getting visuals through cell phones to what Black folks have been talking about for hundreds of years. And so that is what's new. Even with Rodney King, and that was really the first video I know in my modern history as a police officer that I had seen. But I can tell you that even then, those things were questioned. And I'm sure we'll have still more questions, although we have a more proliferation of what you're seeing. And I think that what's going to happen here is we are going to have to really thinking about how do we want our public safety to be delivered. And when we say that, it opens up a broad opportunity here that some folks are comfortable with and others are not. And when we talk about how do we get at this issue of excessive deadly force and use of force, we have to make sure that we account for what is it we think we're trying to do when we use force. And so those questions I know that are definitely on the table for me are not just around what you're going to be hearing traditionally, and that is more training, bring in something different. We're talking about, do we have a good definition and an understanding and identity of what types of folks we want to deliver public service? That's different than law enforcement. The other thing that we're going to have to talk about that has to be put into account is how Black and brown folks are seen in the criminal space, period. So we know that those stereotypical associations of Black men, brown men, and crime fuel a lot of reaction things that are happening that we see in police. We have to make sure that we account for those. The work that we do at the Center for Policing Equity is about that. It is about looking at justice through science, looking at the data, making sure data collection is in place, making sure policies are in alignment, make sure accountability is not only there, but it's actually being implemented and followed through, and that there's oversight and input from community about what those outcomes should be and what they should look like. So when we talk about how do we really address excessive use of force, we need to make sure that we understand the whole dynamic around power. And so one of the things that we also need to make sure we look at is not just policies, because I understand that there's been a lot of work around, looking at policies, is once again, what are we asking folks to do in the name of law enforcement and public safety? And I think once we can make sure we have those things in alignment, make sure that we have the right people actually where we are, making sure that we invest in Black communities, and that means making sure that we don't over-criminalize certain spaces like homelessness, or actually trying to enforce social distancing. So once we make sure that we dismantle those and remove policing from spaces where they don't belong, we should start to see some changes. But it also has to be about what do we want to have happen in the name of public safety. And all of those things that are associated with it are the things that should be on the table for discussion, for whatever needs to happen to make them work in the way in which we believe they're appropriate. Again, all of these things cannot happen unless community, for me, is at the center of the conversations, and as others have said, direct that conversation as well.
No, well, they would be, but there's obviously no incentive for them to do that. I mean, when we look at structural racism, again, there are four I's. There's the ideology, the idea that one particular group is worthless, should be treated differently, and therefore falls in their particular tier on the spectrum. And then you have the institutions like hospitals that reinforce the idea of who should and should not be seen, redlining through mortgage companies and banks who decide who should and should not be granted mortgages and other types of small business or residential loans. And then you have the interpersonal, which is me walking down the street and I'm laughed at and called a nigger, or I'm racially profiled by police and brutalized almost to death, or even just simply harassed, handcuffed, searched, and let go. These are the kinds of things that are reinforced through institutions like media. And then there's the interpersonal, where I actually believe I am worthless because of all of these influential forces from an exterior entity that's telling me about my self-worth and my cognitive capacity. So when we look at law enforcement, again, we've been convict leasing for 125 years, started in Birmingham, Alabama, and this was the beginning of mass incarceration, post the idea of abolishment of slavery, but this was the repackaging. Most well-built slaves got the longest sentences and then were sold into bondage amongst corporations. So when we think about what is their incentive, well, as long as district attorneys offer impunity to the criminal justice system to officers who hurt and kill people, there will never be an incentive for them to change. It's not an amount of training. We don't need to throw money at it because every moral person, my 6-year-old daughter knows better, you know, and she doesn't need an 8-hour course on how to make a moral decision. When you have these types of reinforcements, a gun, a badge, and a DA's office who allow you, and not to mention a police union, who will, even if you're disciplined, allow you an unlimited level of appeals through a matrix that's intended for you to appeal, what is the incentive to change? So this is where I think community has to step in. Bills like, what is it, SB 20-217 that highlight post decertification. You know, on the Post website here in Colorado, there is a number of misdemeanors right there on their website that officers convicted of are supposed to be decertified for, and any felony conviction. So these are the kinds of things that people in the community need to start educating themselves on, and then asking the questions of the individuals like the AG in Colorado who chairs the Post board. How come this officer wasn't decertified when they were convicted of X, Y, and Z? Or how come we have a discipline matrix that has so many opportunities for appeal built directly inside of it? And how do we remove some of those? Or how do we recognize that a district attorney who actually, again, ran uncontested this electoral cycle is held accountable as the most influential player in the entire criminal justice system? These are the things we need to ask to ensure that they are forced to change their behavior. And simply, where do we remove police from areas where they have very little to no expertise at all whatsoever?
I think the wrong thing in this day and age is to expect that law enforcement is going to have a magic pill to address all excessive use of force and correct the problem within a month's time. Not going to happen. I can't personally tell you that we will never have a unlawful use of force again. I can't do that. What I can tell you is I'll hold them accountable should they do something out of context of our policies. I can guarantee that. But most importantly, I think in order to move this needle and how we ignite the community is to really dig deep onto what community policing actually looks like. What does policing, what does public safety in the 21st century in Denver, Colorado, and we talk about for the nation all the time, but I think what does it look like for Denver, that we can really change what that means. I was talking today about how when I'm having an argument with my 4-year-old daughter and my neighbor doesn't like it, the first thing they do is they call 911. And guess what happens? A police officer comes out and they have a law enforcement perspective. Well, you know, we need to really ask that question. A man arguing with his little daughter, does a police officer really need to come to a family dispute? My answer is probably not. We should probably have some other mechanism for other type of response by another type of individual. And there's no cop on this, at least in our department I've talked to, that doesn't agree with that. We also have to understand that we're in a different time than we've ever been in when it comes to mental health, when it comes to all the different types of things that we deal with. And the police are asked to do a myriad of things that probably shouldn't be law enforcement. It should be taken up to a vein in a different way so that we can respond in a different way where arresting and detaining and all those things are off the table, where we're seeing people as people and really identifying those things. So I'm looking forward to this being a community-led effort. I'm looking forward to partnering with the community. That's how we're going to move this needle. I can throw out my ideas all day long. None of those really count. And the reason being is, yes, I'm a Black man, grew up in Denver. However, with the position I hold, it is important that we hear from the community first and that I be the mechanism to break any of the red tape that we may see, and break any of the bureaucracy that we need to do to implement those policies. That's what I see my job as formulating and formulated into. I think we have a prime opportunity right now to change generations and have been able to change the Black community for the good for the next generations to come. If we don't do that now, then we've lost.
All I want with inverted tongue, from whence does fulfillment come? And I expel from this mortal shell, will I die for living up? Though you're someone I can't see, cry to me, and I do.
92 on WJLB. All right, Lynn Worthy.
Hello, I'm Mike Sawaya, the Sawaya Law Firm. We're coming up to an election this year. All of these elections are extremely important, probably some of the most important in the history of the United States. Every one of you who is eligible to vote must get out and vote. Educate yourself, please. Find out who stands for the issues that you believe in. Find out what you believe in, because if you make your voice heard, our democracy can finally win. I'm afraid it's been on a losing streak lately. So let's get with it. Get out and vote.